Slavery as a narrative too can be used to tell a whole range of stories. You can have an underdog story. Of course, always a story about breaking out of it and just rebelling and doing your own thing. Spartacus is a good example. You have the one where you climb the ranks. Look at Gladiator, for example. That's another good one. The possibilities are endless. And especially in things of fiction, more like fantasy, that's like limitless. But there is a point where slavery doesn't really work out. Or does it? If we look at low fantasy settings, it makes sense, okay? It's more close to the real world. Magic really isn't that big of a thing, or it's not that widespread enough to use it in its more leisurely forms. Here's an example. You can technically make a brush do its own job without you having to hold it. Now that's high magic, high fantasy in a way. In low fantasy, they don't really have that, so it makes sense that slavery would be a narrative tool in low fantasy settings, and you can pretty much use the same logic to other different types of settings out there, to other different types of genres as well. But in high fantasy, it doesn't make sense, or does it? Here's the thing. Once you have control to magic that can summon flame tornadoes, well, creating a minion or a companion that can clean your house for you becomes easier to do, right? With magic, you can basically replace any type of manual labor with just it doing it by itself. With that logic in mind, we can see how in high fantasy settings it doesn't really work that well to have slavery. There's no reason for it to exist. We can look at the Tomb Kings of Warhammer Fantasy, or at that weird Egyptian place from Magic the Gathering where they use the dead to build their own things. And it makes sense, it's pretty cool, it's an interesting concept, and I think it helps more as a narrative tool that you have these unliving persons out there just doing jobs. But not all high fantasy is equal. For example, here's an interesting thing. You can technically have slavery in a high fantasy setting if we're talking about a race that isn't that well connected with magic, or isn't known for its magic, or doesn't have access to magic, or they're pretty much screwed out of it. They can't access it, like the dwarves in Warhammer Fantasy. Now that kind of makes sense. It would make sense why a dwarven race that doesn't have access to magic would also be kind of a slaver race. It makes sense to use. Then you can tell some interesting stories out there about how you have this group of elves, humans, orcs, whatever, that are enslaved by the dwarves, and they have to either fight out, go up the ranks, earn their freedom somehow, etc., etc. It makes sense when we look at races with this lack of connection to magic. But what do we do when we have races that are all in when it comes to magic? Well, we don't really can do much because it doesn't make sense for those races to have slavery. It just doesn't work. But it might work in this interesting sense. How widespread is magic in fact? Sure, you can summon flame tornadoes, but how many people are that strong to do it? How many people can really use magic? How powerful is magic? To look at it. It also might be a thing that the higher caste of mages and wizards doesn't want to be reduced to being the team lead in this menial project of building houses, when the humans can probably do it by themselves, the normal people. And I think that helps it a lot, and that makes slavery a little bit more believable in a high fantasy setting with this kind of magic. And it's the arrogance of the wizard class that really pushes that. And you can tell a great story with that one. Granted, it might be a little bit generic, the high arrogant slaver and the slave is breaking out or killing him or whatever, but what's important is that you have characters to work with, you have different things to do here, and you can probably experiment with a few of them. Maybe you have, for example, elf slavers, but one of them is a hobbit, a gnome, who bought his freedom out from the elves and started enslaving his own kind. There's a lot of potential there that you can build up and use from a narrative point of view, and it works. It just depends on how you do it. If you can have a world where magic is used for the most menial of things, it doesn't make sense to also have slaves in it. especially if you don't have arrogant mages and you have mages that can basically do anything and they're incorporated into every project out there. So technically, depending on the world building and how you set things up in your world, slavery can make a bunch of sense to be used in a high fantasy setting. Of course, it comes the drawback that at some point people will ask, why don't the mages just do that? And you always have to explain, oh, they're arrogant, there's few of them, magic's not that widespread, blah blah blah. But here's another interesting narrative point that this can be used with. They're not slavers because they need the slaves, okay? They have magic, they can do whatever they want. They have slaves to sell them to other races. Now that's interesting. Sell them to other kingdoms. Now that's an interesting narrative point of view, because if you want to tell a revenge story and you have this dwarf that was enslaved by goblins and sold to the orcs, then you have a pretty big ladder to go through to get your revenge, to see this dwarf get his revenge using rune magic or whatever. So we already can know that there's two aspects where it works, depending on the magic and depending on what they do with the slaves. And that's another interesting point that can work when using slavery as a narrative tool. And it's not that far-fetched because we know what happened in history. We know that people were sold into slavery after being conquered by a certain race, and that's it. They got richer by selling the slaves to other people, and it works. It works as a story, and we have historical evidence of that and historical knowledge of that. So we can also add that to the fencing while in heavy armor part of our story because it's cool. If we look at another historical example, we can say that the slaves are used as the front line. The first line, a conquering war, the one that's surely going to die, but it's there. And it works, it makes sense. We've seen the Mongols do that with people they've captured. Or you can do something else. You can have the slavers be so arrogant that they don't send the slaves to war, they go themselves to war. We can get inspired a little by Sparta here and really create a warrior cast of that level where they think war is an honorable thing and only proper warriors should do it. Another example you can take from fiction is from the book Descent of Angels, where there are some knights that really don't like that the Imperium really is taking in everybody they can into the Imperial army because war is a noble thing to them. So we can see that we can use slavery in a whole bunch of ways that really can work. So it kind of makes sense to use it in high fantasy as well. You just have to put some good legwork in there for it to make sense at the end of the day. And it's not that hard to do, especially with all the knowledge of history that exists out there. So you know what? It does make sense to have slavery in a high fantasy system, in a high fantasy world. And that's all thanks to the magic of world building. I hope you like this. Please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. Arrivederci.